This video is now in session, and we finally have the results for the New York City mayoral election, or at least the Democratic Mayoral Primary. And in the primary, it has been seen that Eric Adams is the apparent winner of the Democratic primary. He wins with just 1% of the vote in a new ranked choice voting system. So it started off from the first round all the way to the 8th round, where we saw a matchup between Eric Adams and Catherine Garcia. Now, in terms of comparing the results to our prediction, we're 75% correct, which means that we're 50% correct, because we switched up Maya Wiley and Andrew Yang, which shows that progressives in New York still have a large voice. If we look at city council, progressives were able to make large gains in city council seats. So even if Eric Adams wins the mayoral election, which is at this point very likely, he will have to face progressive councilmen and women and people in the New York City Council. And this council has the most amount of LGBTQ members than ever before. So it's becoming more indicative of Democratic politics and the Democratic demographic in New York City. So let's dissect this, because there are a lot of things to go through with this race, not only with how Eric Adams won, but also with ranked choice voting, the New York City Board of Elections, and how tabulations are incredibly important. So let's start off with Eric Adams. We've discussed about him many times. He was a former police chief, and now he's the current president of the Brooklyn Borough, and over the years, he has developed a resume of working in the inside of the politics of New York City, which can be very cutthroat and can be very tense. So Eric Adams, a political outsider, was able to get into the system, and using his police chief experience, he was able to gain a lot of votes. But there's a thing about ranked choice voting, which it's very good for actually getting the voice, the representative voice of the people. But at the same time, though, ranked choice voting will still be hotly debated, and we've seen ranked choice voting expand in several states and in cities like Alaska, Maine, and now New York City, among other cities like Oakland, San Francisco. But the thing is, with ranked choice voting, it requires the voter to have a certain amount of knowledge that a lot of New Yorkers in this election did not have knowledge about. For ranked choice voting in New York, you have to rank the top 5 candidates of your choice from 1 to 5, and from there it gets tabulated. But for a lot of people, it's very hard to determine who they should rank first, second, third, or it's particularly hard for them to rank third, fourth, and fifth when they might only know 1 or 2 candidates. And in fact, Eric Adams may well have won because people knew him more, because he had more name recognition than some of the other candidates. When we talk about Catherine Garcia, she was relatively unknown. Now, this can easily be reputed. This is the hypothesis of many people as to how Eric Adams won, but this is obviously repudiated by the fact that Catherine Garcia got second. So ranked choice voting is interesting, and what it does is, it was actually Catherine Garcia almost won, and if Catherine Garcia won this election, it would be a demonstration of the reason why ranked choice voting is put in place, which is to get the overall sense of what the people actually want. For example, let's take the 2020 Democratic presidential primary. In that system, it goes through the first past the post, which means that whichever candidate gets a plurality of votes then wins that election. So we saw in the let me reframe this. So the 2016 Republican presidential primary, let's use that example instead, because it's more of a clear example. We had Donald Trump as the front runner, and then everyone else. In terms of the moderate establishment Republicans, they were Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz is not establishment, but we'll count him as one in this demonstration. So we had Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, as well as John Kasich, and Jeb Bush. So all of these candidates represented the majority of the voice in the Republican Party, at least initially speaking. Meanwhile, Donald Trump represented a minority of the voice. But because there were 5 different candidates, Bush, as well as Rubio, Cruz, and then among other candidates like Kasich and Chris Christie, then a lot of the Republican voters started splitting their vote between these candidates. Meanwhile, the Trump base, which even though they are a minority, they all vote for the president, for Donald Trump, and he was able to win because of that system, because of the first past the post system. But what ranked choice voting does is it makes people rank their candidates, and then from there the lowest ranked candidate goes and gets out of the race, and then their votes are distributed. Those first choice votes are then become second choice votes, and it keeps going on and on and on until you get two candidates left, and whoever has the majority of votes wins the election. And the purpose of that is to provide more moderation, and moderation obviously in American politics is well favored. So that is what this kind of system does, and that's and this race would, if Catherine Garcia won, that would have been a perfect representation of the point of ranked choice voting, which is that even though you have moderates split in their vote and maybe the progressives having one block of votes, then later in the rounds you'll see that the progressive vote gets diminished. And that's not to say it goes against the progressive vote, because ultimately even in the first past the post system, we still would have seen Eric Adams win in the primary. But the point is moderation, and the point is to actually get the voices of the majority of New Yorkers. If the most New Yorkers were in favor of progressive politics, then Maya Wiley would have easily won the election. But obviously in this election, a lot was shown about crime. Now, not only did this election show about crime, but it also showed something completely different and unexpected. We've seen throughout this race how chaotic it was, but just a week ago, the New York City Board of Elections released their first tally of unofficial results, and in those results, they were pretty botched. So what happened was that Catherine Garcia was at the 8th round, initially speaking, 2 percentage points of a deficit from Eric Adams. And then not only that, but also there were somehow more votes that were put into the tabulation process than were actually projected. So a lot of people started questioning the results, and what was found out was that the New York City Board of Elections, which manages these primaries, they put 130,000 test ballots into that preliminary count. And that's an incredibly stupid thing to do for any kind of board of elections, let alone from the biggest city in America, or the biggest one of the biggest metropolitan areas. So it's it's incredible embarrassment to the election process of New York City. And it's been going on for several years at this point. The New York City Board of Elections is tied in in a lot of corruption, in a lot of nepotism. And over the past several elections, we've seen how they have repeatedly made mistakes over and over again as to how to manage elections. The New York City Board of Elections, the people who are elected into those positions are not really even elected. They're managed by the bosses of the Democratic and Republican parties, and even though it's a bipartisan commission, none of the members who are actually in the New York City Board of Elections deserve to be on that board. We've seen how they've purged 200,000 people from voter rolls. They forced some voters to wait for hours, and then they sent ballots to 100,000 New Yorkers that were not supposed to be sent. In addition, we've seen in the 2020 election and the 2016 election that they took days, weeks even, to report the full results from their precincts, from the 5 boroughs of New York City, compared to other cities like Los Angeles, which did it a lot quicker. In the beginning of the election, New York City was one of the last states to actually get their vote results in, and that was because of New York City and its 5 boroughs, with the New York City Board of Elections absolutely botching the tabulation results for that election and taken longer than expected. So there have been questions about the New York City Board of Elections, and they do deserve to be thrown out, but obviously corruption has let them stay in for several years, and it's likely that corruption will let them stay for another couple of years. But this is also very indicative of another problem that America is facing with its elections, which is not only that is there a fight over whether to use absentee ballots or not, whether to how to balance election security with the ability to vote, but then there's also the question that's not being asked, which is how do we fix our tabulations of voting? Because we do have a tabulation problem. It took 6 days to actually project the winner of the presidential election using absentee ballots, and as well as other, in-person and early vote-in ballots. And that's something very concerning for the future of American elections, because we've seen how elections have gotten more and more competitive, and we've seen that candidates have now contested more and more about these elections. So if our tabulation process is not secure, if our tabulation process is not actually quick and efficient, then there will be questions. There will be questions about the results, and there will be a slew of candidates in future elections who will contest results, even though it might be based off of no evidence. And that's a problem for American elections, which is that the more time it takes to actually tabulate these elections, the more uncertainty there is about the actual the worthiness of the elections, the fairness of these elections. So in the future, when it comes to Congress making bills, they not only have to figure out if absentee ballots should be expanded and if voter ID should be mandated, but they also should have to figure out how to fix the tabulations of our elections. In a lot of other countries, it does not take this long to count absentee ballots. It doesn't take this long to count ranked choice voting. In other cities around the world, like London, in other places, it takes a lot shorter to actually count these results, and people don't contest them. So for our elections, we have to upgrade our infrastructure of tabulations. We have to be able to hire more poll workers. We have to find a more efficient way to tabulate these results. But very simply said, we need people who actually care about elections to be running them. Because if we have the New York City Board of Elections, if we replicated their Board of Elections across all cities in the United States, then we're in a huge trouble. So it's not a good sign to see that a Board of Elections in one of the biggest cities put in 130,000 test ballots when tabulating the results. And this also shows that tabulations of votes and election problems don't only apply to Republicans. They also apply to Democrats. In the Texas state legislature, we've seen voter suppression laws trying to be put into place. But meanwhile, we see Democratic places, and they're having a lot of the same problem, and a lot of them, not the same problems, but they're having a lot of problems when it comes to elections. Yet for a lot of Democrats, they give these Board of Elections a pass because they're in Democratic cities. So it's going to be tough, but for Democrats, they ought to actually be consistent with their messaging of improving elections, not only in Republican state legislatures, but also in their own backyards in New York City and as well as other places. So those are all the things that have to be taken account when it comes to elections. It's not only about who can vote and how you can vote, but how those votes are actually counted. And that will be an important debate and a very necessary debate in future elections, because of, again, these elections are becoming more competitive. Donald Trump was lost by only just a couple of thousands of votes. If he was able to get Wisconsin, Georgia, and Arizona, we would have had a much different result than we currently have. If Hillary Clinton was able to get Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, which she was very close to doing, then we would have had a very much different discussion. So as a result, with these such close elections, people are obviously going to contest it, and as a result, it's our job to actually make elections secure, and it's our job to make sure that Americans have confidence in the electoral system. So that's the New York City mayoral election. That's how ranked choice voting works, how it's good, and how we need to figure out our tabulating processes. So Eric Adams is the winner. Now, for a lot of New Yorkers, he is much better than de Blasio, and honestly, for a lot of people, a lot of New Yorkers, any candidate, any Democratic candidate, in the top 4 position is better than Bill de Blasio, but Eric Adams is going to try to bring more moderate politics into the New York City process, and we'll see how he does as mayor, because it's a 4-year term, and he does have a lot of goals on housing and as well as crime. So that's the end of this video. Hope you enjoyed it. This video is now adjourned, and I'll see you in the next one.